Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition and protocol reigned supreme, a shocking incident occurred that would forever change the delicate balance of the British royal family. What happens when the Queen Consort decides to block the King's own sister from entering a private royal gathering? When Princess, and known for her unwavering dedication and fierce loyalty to the crown, found herself standing at locked doors while family members gathered inside, the royal foundations trembled. This is the true story of how one woman's jealousy and insecurity led to a confrontation that exposed the deep cracks within the modern monarchy. A tale of sibling bonds tested, royal protocol shattered, and a king forced to choose between his wife and his sister. What Charles discovered after the fact would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about the woman he married and the family he thought he could trust. The incident that unfolded on that fateful evening would become the catalyst for revelations that no amount of royal spin could contain. This is the story the palace never wanted you to hear. The autumn rain pelted against the windows of Clarence House as Queen Consort Camilla paced nervously across the Persian carpet in her private sitting room. Her fingers drummed against the mahogany side table, a habit she had developed over the years whenever anxiety crept in her thoughts. Tonight was different from the usual royal engagements or state dinners. Tonight was personal, and Camilla intended to keep it that way. The guest list for the intimate family gathering had been carefully curated by Camilla herself, a fact she had deliberately hidden from her husband, King Charles. The occasion was meant to be a celebration of their recent successful tour of Australia, but Camilla had ulterior motives. She wanted to establish her position within the family hierarchy once and for all, and there was one person she considered a significant obstacle to that goal. Princess, and had always been a thorn in Camilla's side. The king's sister possessed an unwavering sense of duty that made Camilla feel inadequate by comparison. Anne's decades of royal service, her no-nonsense approach to royal duties, and, most importantly, her unshakable bond with Charles had long been sources of irritation for the Queen Consort. While other family members had gradually warmed to Camilla over the years and remained politely distant, professional, but never truly accepting, the Princess Royal had a way of looking at Camilla that made her feel like an outsider, even after all these years. It was not open hostility, but rather a cool assessment that seemed to find Camilla wanting, and never said anything directly critical, but her silence spoke volumes. When Charles would recount childhood memories or discuss royal traditions, and would nod knowingly, sharing in experiences that Camilla could never be part of. These moments of exclusion had accumulated over time, building into a resentment that Camilla struggled to contain. Earlier that afternoon, Camilla had instructed the household staff to inform Princess and that the evening's gathering had been postponed indefinitely. The message was delivered by telephone to Anne's private secretary, a formal communication that seemed routine and official. However, the gathering was proceeding exactly as planned, with other family members already confirming their attendance. The Queen Consort had also made sure that the usual security protocols would be adjusted for the evening. She spoke privately with the head of royal protection, explaining that Princess Anne would not be attending and that her name should be removed from the approved guest list. To the security team, this seemed like a standard administrative update, nothing more than the usual last-minute changes that occurred in royal households. As 6 o'clock approached, Camilla's carefully orchestrated plan was set in motion. The dining room at Clarence House had been prepared for an intimate gathering of 12 people, including several of Charles's closest friends and some of Camilla's family members. The table settings gleamed under the crystal chandelier, and the staff moved efficiently through their final preparations. Charles arrived home from his afternoon engagements at the Royal Opera House, where he had been reviewing plans for upcoming cultural patronage events. He seemed relaxed and pleased with the day's work, commenting to Camilla about the quality of the productions and the dedication of the performers. His mood was light, and he appeared to be looking forward to a quiet evening with family and close friends. Meanwhile, Princess Anne had just finished her own royal duties at a military ceremony in Hampshire. She had been looking forward to the family gathering, particularly because such intimate occasions had become increasingly rare since Charles's coronation, and valued these opportunities to connect with her brother away from the formal constraints of state functions. She had even adjusted her schedule earlier in the week to ensure her attendance. At 6:30, Anne's Bentley pulled up to the gates of Clarence House. The Princess Royal was dressed elegantly, but not formally, wearing a navy blue dress with a simple strand of pearls, appropriate for a family dinner. She carried a small gift bag containing a first-edition book about botanical illustration that she had found for Charles, knowing his passion for gardening and environmental conservation. The first sign that something was amiss came when the security guard at the gate consulted his list twice before approaching the vehicle. Anne's protection officer, who had been with her for several years and knew the usual protocols, also seemed puzzled by the delay. The gate guard walked slowly to the driver's side window, his expression uncertain and slightly uncomfortable, and rolled down her window, expecting the usual brief greeting and immediate access to the property. Instead, the guard's words struck her like a physical blow. He explained, with obvious discomfort, that her name was not on the approved guest list for the evening. The guard suggested there might have been some administrative error and offered to call the main house for clarification. The Princess Royal sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing the unprecedented situation. In decades of royal life, she had never been denied entry to a family member's residence. The concept was so foreign to her experience that she initially assumed there had indeed been some mistake. She asked her protection officer to contact the house directly while she waited in the vehicle, confident that the confusion would be resolved quickly. Inside Clarence House, the first guests were beginning to arrive for cocktails in the drawing room. Camilla moved among them with practiced grace, playing the perfect hostess. She ensured that conversations flowed smoothly and that everyone felt welcome and valued. Charles mingled easily with the guests, many of whom were long-standing friends who had supported the couple through various challenges over the years. The phone call from the gate came through to the household staff, who immediately recognized the unusual nature of the situation. The head butler, who had worked for the royal family for over 20 years, knew that Princess Anne's exclusion from any family gathering would be highly irregular. However, he had received clear instructions from the Queen consort earlier in the day, and his professional training demanded that he follow the established protocols. The butler approached Camilla discreetly during a lull in the conversation, speaking in the low, measured tones that royal staff had perfected over generations. He informed her that Princess Anne was at the gate requesting clarification about the guest list. Camilla's response was swift and definitive. She instructed the butler to confirm that there had been no mistake and that the Princess Royal was not expected that evening. Back at the gate, Anne received the butler's message through a protection officer. The words hit her with a force that she struggled to contain. This was not an administrative error or a miscommunication about timing. This was a deliberate exclusion orchestrated by someone within the household. The realization brought with it a mixture of hurt, anger, and profound disappointment that threatened to overwhelm her usual composed demeanor. The Princess Royal had faced many challenges throughout her royal career, from public criticism to personal setbacks. But this felt different. This was not an external attack or media scrutiny that she could weather with dignity and silence. This was a rejection from within her own family, from the very heart of the institution she had served faithfully for her entire adult life. Anne's protection officer suggested several courses of action, including attempting to contact King Charles directly or speaking with other members of the royal household. However, Anne understood the implications of the situation better than anyone. If Camilla had gone to the trouble of orchestrating her exclusion, then any attempt to circumvent that decision would create an even more uncomfortable situation for everyone involved. The decision to leave was perhaps one of the most difficult Anne had ever made. Every instinct told her to fight this unprecedented slight, to demand explanations, and assert her rightful place within the family hierarchy. However, her years of royal training and her innate sense of dignity prevented her from creating a scene that would inevitably become public knowledge and damage the monarchy's reputation. As her vehicle pulled away from Clarence's house, Princess and felt a profound sense of isolation that she had never experienced before. The warm lights spilling from the windows seemed to mock her exclusion, and she could imagine the conversations and laughter continuing inside without any acknowledgement of her absence. The gift she had brought for Charles remained unopened in her lap, a tangible reminder of the connection that had apparently been severed. The drive back to her own residence passed in contemplative silence. Anne's mind raced through possible explanations for Camilla's actions, trying to understand what had motivated such a drastic step. She reviewed recent interactions, searching for clues about what might have triggered this level of animosity. However, no single incident seemed significant enough to warrant such treatment. The Princess Royal had always prided herself on her ability to navigate complex family dynamics with grace and wisdom. She had managed to maintain positive relationships with various royal family members through decades of change and challenge. However, this situation presented entirely new territory, a deliberate act of exclusion that violated every principle of royal protocol and family loyalty. Meanwhile, inside Clarence's house, the dinner progressed without any mention of Anne's absence. Camilla had anticipated that Charles might ask about his sister, so she had prepared a simple explanation about and being unable to attend due to a scheduling conflict. However, Charles was engaged in animated conversation with old friends and seemed not to notice the gap in the guest list. The evening's conversation ranged from current events to shared memories, with Charles appearing relaxed and genuinely enjoying the company. Camilla watched her husband carefully, noting his mood and ensuring that nothing disturbed the positive atmosphere she had worked so hard to create. In her mind, the evening was proving that the family could function perfectly well without Anne's presence. However, as the night progressed, Camilla found herself unable to fully enjoy her apparent victory. The knowledge of what she had done created an undercurrent of anxiety that she struggled to suppress. She found herself overcompensating, being more attentive to guests, and more animated in conversation than usual. The other guests seemed to enjoy themselves, but Camilla's enjoyment was tainted by the knowledge of her deception. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Camilla felt both relief and apprehension. The immediate goal had been achieved, but she knew that the consequences of her actions were yet to unfold. Princess Anne was not someone who would simply accept such treatment without response, and Charles would eventually discover what had transpired. The Queen Consort had set in motion events that would test the very foundations of royal family relationships. Her desire to establish dominance within the family hierarchy had led her to cross lines that had never been crossed before. The question now was whether she could maintain the deception long enough to consolidate her position, or whether the truth would emerge in ways that she could not control. As Charles prepared for bed that evening, he mentioned casually that he was looking forward to seeing Anne soon and hoped she was not overworking herself. The innocent comment struck Camilla like a dagger, reminding her that her husband's love for his sister remained unchanged despite her efforts to create distance between them. The battle lines had been drawn, but the war was far from over. Princess Anne spent the following morning in her private study at Gatcombe Park, staring out at the rolling countryside that had always provided her with solace during difficult times. The events of the previous evening replayed in her mind with crystalline clarity, each detail etched into her memory with painful precision. She had barely slept, her thoughts churning through the implications of Camilla's unprecedented action and the best way to respond to such calculated hostility. The Princess Royal had built her reputation on directness and authenticity, qualities that had served her well throughout decades of public service. However, this situation required a more nuanced approach than her usual straightforward style. She could not simply confront Camilla directly without risking a family schism that would inevitably become public knowledge and damage the monarchy's carefully maintained image of unity. Anne's first instinct had been to telephone Charles immediately and demand an explanation. However, as she considered the conversation that would follow, she realized that such an approach would force her brother to choose sides in a conflict he knew nothing about. Charles's happiness with Camilla was evident to everyone who knew them, and had no desire to destroy that contentment with revelations about his wife's vindictive behavior. Instead, the Princess Royal decided to document everything that had occurred, creating a detailed record of events that might prove useful if the situation escalated further. She wrote everything down in her precise handwriting, noting times, conversations, and the reactions of everyone involved. This methodical approach helped her process her emotions while creating a factual account that could not be disputed or distorted later. As Anne worked on her documentation, she received a telephone call from her lady-in-waiting, who had heard rumors about the previous evening's gathering through the royal household network. The staff members who worked across various royal residences often shared information informally, and word of Anne's exclusion had begun to circulate quietly among those who managed the family's day-to-day affairs. The lady-in-waiting's concern was evident in her voice as she asked if there had been some misunderstanding about the invitation. Anne's response was carefully measured, acknowledging that there had been some confusion without going into detail about what had actually transpired. However, the very fact that questions were being asked indicated that Camilla's attempt at secrecy was already beginning to unravel. Meanwhile, at Clarence's house, Camilla was experiencing her own morning of reflection and growing anxiety. The satisfaction she had felt the previous evening was rapidly being replaced by apprehension about the potential consequences of her actions. She had acted impulsively, driven by years of accumulated resentment and jealousy, without fully considering the long-term implications of her behavior. The Queen Consort's morning routine usually included reviewing her schedule with her private secretary and discussing upcoming engagements. However, she found herself distracted and unable to concentrate on the usual administrative details. Her secretary noticed her agitation and asked if there was anything specific troubling her, but Camilla dismissed the concern with a wave of her hand. Charles, meanwhile, remained completely unaware of the drama that had unfolded in his absence the previous evening. His morning was occupied with constitutional duties and meetings with government officials, the routine business of monarchy that consumed much of his time. He had enjoyed the previous evening's gathering and made a mental note to organize similar intimate dinners more frequently. During his lunch break, Charles decided to call his sister to catch up on family matters and share some amusing anecdotes from the previous evening's dinner. This was a routine that the siblings had maintained for years, a way of staying connected despite their busy schedules and different roles within the royal framework. Anne answered the phone in her study, her heart sinking as she heard the cheerful tone in her brother's voice. Charles began recounting stories from the dinner, describing conversations with mutual friends and sharing gossip about various attendees. His obvious enjoyment of the evening made Anne's exclusion even more painful to bear. As Charles continued his narrative, he suddenly paused and asked why Anne had not been there. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with significance that only Anne fully understood. She could hear the genuine puzzlement in her brother's voice, confirming what she had suspected all along, that Charles had no knowledge of her deliberate exclusion. Anne's response was carefully crafted to avoid creating an immediate crisis, while still conveying that something was amiss. She mentioned that she had received information about the dinner being postponed and had made other arrangements for the evening. The explanation was technically truthful while avoiding the more damaging details about who had provided that false information. Charles accepted his sister's explanation without question, but something in her tone made him pause. He had known Anne for his entire life and could detect subtle changes in her mood that others might miss. There was a restraint in her voice that suggested she was not telling him everything, but he could not identify exactly what might be troubling her. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Charles sharing additional details about the evening and responding with appropriate interest and questions. However, both siblings were now aware that something was not quite right, though they interpreted the undercurrents of the conversation differently. After ending the call, Charles sat in his office, contemplating the subtle tension he had detected in his sister's voice. He tried to recall the details of how the dinner invitation had been extended and who had been responsible for communicating with various family members. The more he thought about it, the more questions arose in his mind about the entire arrangement. Charles decided to speak with his private secretary about the guest list and invitation process, framing his inquiry as a general review of how family gatherings were organized. The private secretary confirmed that the Queen Consort had taken personal responsibility for arranging the previous evening's dinner, including managing the guest list and all communications with potential attendees. This information triggered a vague sense of unease in Charles's mind, though he could not yet articulate exactly what was troubling him. He had always trusted Camilla to handle social arrangements competently, and she had never given him reason to doubt her judgment in such matters. However, the combination of Anne's strange tone and the exclusive nature of Camilla's management of the dinner created a nagging doubt that he could not dismiss. Back at Gatcombe Park, Princess Anne was facing her own difficult decisions about how to proceed. She had completed her written record of events and was now considering her options for addressing the situation. Direct confrontation with Camilla seemed likely to escalate the conflict without resolving the underlying issues. However, allowing the behavior to go unchallenged might encourage further acts of hostility, and decided to seek counsel from her daughter Zara, who had always been a trusted confidant and possessed a practical wisdom that Anne valued highly. Zara's perspective as someone who was part of the royal family, but not bound by the same protocols and constraints, might provide insights that Anne could not see from her position within the institutional hierarchy. The conversation with Zara took place that afternoon during a walk around the Gatcombe Park estate, where they could speak freely without concern about being overheard, and explained the events of the previous evening in detail, watching as her daughter's expression shifted from surprise to anger to strategic calculation. Zara's response was characteristically direct and uncompromising. She felt that Camilla's behavior was not only disrespectful to and personally, but also damaging to the broader family dynamic and the institution they all served. Zara argued that allowing such behavior to continue unchecked would embolden Camilla to further acts of manipulation and exclusion. However, Zara also recognized the delicate nature of the situation and the potential for any response to create broader family conflicts. She suggested that Anne should focus on documenting patterns of behavior rather than responding to individual incidents, building a case that could be presented to Charles if and when the situation became untenable. Meanwhile, Camilla was beginning to realize that her attempt at secrecy might not hold up under scrutiny. The royal household network was extensive and interconnected, and information had a way of traveling through unofficial channels that were difficult to control. She had already received subtle questions from staff members about the guest list arrangements, suggesting that people were beginning to notice inconsistencies. The Queen Consort's anxiety was further heightened when Charles mentioned his conversation with and during their evening meal together. He described his sister's unusual tone and his sense that she might be dealing with some unspecified problem. Charles's concern for her and was evident, and Camilla found herself having to feign similar worry while knowing that she was the cause of Anne's distress. Camilla's response was to suggest that Anne might be overworking herself and perhaps needed some time to rest and recover from her demanding schedule. This explanation allowed her to express apparent concern while subtly reinforcing the idea that Anne's absence from social gatherings might be beneficial for her well-being. However, Charles knew his sister well enough to recognize that she thrived on her royal duties and rarely showed signs of being overwhelmed by her responsibilities. Anne's work ethic and resilience were legendary within the royal family, making Camilla's suggestion seem implausible to anyone who knew the Princess Royal personally. As the week progressed, the tension between what Charles was being told and what he observed created an increasingly uncomfortable cognitive dissonance. His own observations of and during subsequent conversations suggested someone who was troubled but not exhausted. The inconsistency gnawed at him, creating doubts about explanations he had initially accepted without question. The situation was further complicated by the fact that other family members were beginning to notice the change in dynamics. Prince William and Catherine had expected to see and at recent family gatherings and had asked about her absence. Their questions required explanations that became increasingly difficult to maintain consistently. Camilla found herself weaving an increasingly complex web of half-truths and misdirections to maintain her deception. Each conversation required careful thought about what had been said previously and to whom, creating a mental burden that affected her ability to focus on her other responsibilities. The stress of maintaining the charade was beginning to show in her behavior, though she tried to hide her anxiety from Charles. Princess, and, meanwhile, was continuing her royal duties with characteristic dedication, but those who worked closely with her could detect a subtle change in her demeanor. She was more reserved in her interactions and seemed to be processing some internal conflict that she was not ready to share. Her staff respected her privacy too much to ask direct questions, but they noticed a change and wondered what might be troubling their usually straightforward employer. The most difficult moments for her and came during family events where both she and Camilla were present. The queen consort's behavior toward and remained superficially cordial, but there was an undercurrent of triumph in her manner that was visible to anyone paying close attention, and responded with her usual professional courtesy. But the strain of maintaining appearances was becoming increasingly challenging. Charles began to notice these subtle tensions during family interactions, though he initially attributed them to normal personality differences and the stresses of royal life. However, as the pattern became more evident, he started to question whether something more significant was occurring beneath the surface of family relationships. The breaking point came during a family dinner at Windsor Castle, where Anne and Camilla were seated near each other according to traditional protocol. Throughout the meal, Camilla made several subtle comments that could be interpreted as innocent conversation, but carried undertones of superiority and dismissal that Anne recognized as deliberate provocation. Anne's response was to maintain her dignity and composure, but Charles noticed his sister's increasing quietness as the evening progressed. The contrast between Anne's usual animated participation in family discussions and her subdued behavior that evening was stark enough to catch his attention and increase his concerns about what might be troubling her. By the end of that evening, Charles had made a decision to investigate the source of the tensions he was observing. He could no longer dismiss his concerns as imagination or normal family dynamics. Something was clearly wrong, and as both king and brother, he felt obligated to understand what was happening and address any problems before they escalated further. The stage was now set for revelations that would force Charles to confront uncomfortable truths about his wife's behavior and the impact it was having on his relationship with his sister. The careful balance of family harmony that Camilla had tried to manipulate in her favor was beginning to crumble under the weight of her own deceptions. King Charles awakened on a gray November morning with an uncomfortable weight pressing on his chest, the accumulated anxiety from weeks of subtle family tensions finally demanding his attention. The breakfast room at Clarence House felt unusually quiet as he sat alone with his morning newspapers, Camilla having left early for a series of engagements with women's charities. The absence gave him space to think clearly about the nagging concerns that had been growing in his mind like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. The previous evening's family dinner at Windsor Castle had crystallized his worries into something he could no longer ignore. Anne's subdued behavior throughout the meal had been so uncharacteristic that other family members had noticed and commented on it privately to Charles. William had asked if his aunt was feeling unwell, while Catherine had expressed concern about and seeming unusually withdrawn from family conversations. Charles had deflected these concerns with vague explanations about royal duties and busy schedules, but privately he knew that these explanations did not fit with his sister's usual demeanor, and had always been one of the most engaging members of the family during intimate gatherings, her dry wit and practical insights contributing significantly to family discussions. Her recent silence felt like a fundamental shift in family dynamics that demanded investigation. The king decided to begin his inquiry systematically, starting with a review of recent family social arrangements. He called for his private secretary and requested copies of guest lists and correspondence related to family gatherings over the past several weeks. The request was framed as a general review of social protocols, but Charles was specifically looking for patterns that might explain the changes he had observed. The documents arrived within an hour, neatly organized in a leather portfolio that Charles reviewed in the privacy of his study. As he examined the guest lists and invitation schedules, certain inconsistencies became apparent. N's name appeared on preliminary lists for several events, but was absent from final arrangements, with notations indicating last-minute scheduling conflicts or health concerns. What troubled Charles most was that he had no memory of being consulted about these changes, nor did he recall mentioning any of the conflicts or concerns noted in the official records. As someone who spoke regularly with his sister about family and royal matters, he would have expected to hear about significant scheduling issues or health problems that prevented her attendance at family gatherings. Charles decided to call and directly to discuss her recent absence from family events, but he approached the conversation carefully to avoid creating alarm or forcing her into uncomfortable explanations. He began with casual conversation about upcoming royal duties and shared interests, gradually working toward the topic that truly concerned him. When Charles asked about her health and whether she was managing her royal schedule effectively, Anne's response confirmed his suspicions that something was amiss. Her assurances that she was feeling perfectly well and managing her duties without difficulty contradicted the official explanations for her absences from family gatherings. The inconsistency was too significant to dismiss as miscommunication or administrative error. Anne's voice carried undertones that Charles recognized from their childhood, subtle indicators that she was holding back information she considered potentially harmful or disruptive. As siblings, they had developed an intuitive understanding of each other's moods and motivations that allowed them to communicate on multiple levels simultaneously, and was clearly troubled by something she felt unable or unwilling to discuss openly. Charles ended the conversation with growing certainty that his sister was dealing with a problem that went beyond scheduling conflicts or personal health issues. The combination of her obvious distress and her reluctance to explain it suggested that the source of the problem was someone or something within the royal family itself. This realization brought with it a sense of dread about what he might discover if he continued his investigation. The king's next step was to speak confidentially with senior household staff who had been involved in organizing recent family gatherings. He began with the head butler at Clarence House, a man who had served the royal family for over 2 decades and possessed intimate knowledge of royal protocols and family dynamics. The conversation took place in Charles's private study, where they could speak without interruption or concern about being overheard. The butler's responses to Charles's careful questions revealed additional inconsistencies in the official record of family gathering arrangements. While maintaining appropriate professional discretion, the butler indicated that there had been some unusual aspects to the organization of recent events, particularly regarding communication with Princess Anne's household about invitations and schedule changes. When pressed gently for more specific information, the butler mentioned that the Queen Consort had taken personal responsibility for managing guest lists and communications for several recent gatherings. While this was not necessarily unusual, it represented a departure from previous practices where such arrangements had typically been handled collectively by household staff with input from both Charles and Camilla. The butler also revealed that there had been some confusion among staff members about Princess Anne's attendance at various events, with conflicting information about whether she had been invited, had declined invitations, or had been unable to attend due to scheduling conflicts. The level of confusion was unusual for a household that prided itself on precision and clear communication. Charles thanked the butler for his insights, while carefully avoiding any suggestion that he suspected wrongdoing or deception. However, The conversation had provided enough information to confirm that the problems he was observing had administrative rather than personal origins. Someone within the household was manipulating family social arrangements, and the most likely candidate was becoming increasingly clear. The king's investigation continued with discreet inquiries to other staff members who had been involved in family event planning. Security personnel, administrative assistants, and household coordinators all provided pieces of information that, when assembled together, painted a disturbing picture of deliberate exclusion and deception centered on Princess Anne's participation in family gatherings. The security team's records were particularly revealing, showing instances where Anne's name had been removed from approved guest lists at the last minute, often without the usual authorization procedures that govern such changes. The modifications had been made with sufficient authority to prevent questions from being asked, but they represented significant departures from established protocols. As Charles pieced together the evidence from various sources, a clear pattern emerged that pointed directly to Camilla's involvement in systematically excluding and from family social events. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, challenging everything he thought he understood about his wife's character and her relationships within the royal family. The king found himself facing an unprecedented personal and institutional crisis. The woman he loved and trusted had apparently been engaging in petty vindictive behavior that threatened the unity and stability of the royal family. The implications extended far beyond personal hurt feelings to encompass questions about Camilla's fitness for her role as queen consort and the potential damage to the monarchy's reputation if the situation became public knowledge. Charles spent several hours alone in his study, grappling with the emotional and practical implications of his discoveries. His love for Camilla had survived numerous challenges over the years, including public opposition to their relationship and criticism of Camilla's suitability for royal life. However, this situation represented a fundamental betrayal of trust and family loyalty that struck at the core of his identity as both husband and brother. The king's immediate instinct was to confront Camilla directly and demand explanations for her behavior. However, he recognized that such a confrontation needed to be carefully planned to avoid creating an even larger crisis. He needed to understand her motivations and assess whether the behavior represented a temporary lapse in judgment or a more serious character flaw that could affect her future role as queen consort. Charles also had to consider the impact on Anne, who had clearly been suffering in silence rather than creating family conflicts that could damage the monarchy. His sister's dignified response to Camilla's hostility demonstrated the same sense of duty and institutional loyalty that had characterized her entire royal career. However, Charles knew that such treatment could not continue without serious consequences for family relationships and his personal well-being. The complexity of the situation was further heightened by the need to consider the broader implications for the royal family and the monarchy as an institution. Any public revelation of conflict between the queen consort and the princess royal would provide ammunition for Republicans and critics of the monarchy, potentially undermining public support for the institution that Charles had dedicated his life to serving. As evening approached, Charles made the decision to postpone any direct action until he could develop a comprehensive strategy for addressing the situation. He needed to speak with and privately to understand her perspective and assess the full extent of the damage that had been done. He also needed to prepare for a conversation with Camilla that would likely be one of the most difficult of their marriage. The king's discovery had transformed his understanding of recent family dynamics and forced him to question assumptions about relationships and loyalties that he had taken for granted. The careful balance of personal happiness and royal duty that he had worked to maintain throughout his life was now under threat from actions taken by someone he had trusted completely. Charles spent his final waking hours that night contemplating the challenges that lay ahead and the difficult decisions he would need to make. The revelation about Camilla's behavior toward and had opened a rift in his world that could not be easily closed. The question now was whether the relationships and institutions he valued most could survive the confrontations that seemed inevitable. The stakes could not have been higher. As king, Charles had responsibilities to the monarchy that transcended personal relationships and family dynamics. However, as a brother and husband, he also had obligations to protect those he loved while addressing behaviors that threatened the foundations of family trust and unity. The balance between these competing demands would test every aspect of his character and judgment in the days to come. The storm that had been building through weeks of subtle tensions and growing suspicions was about to break with full force. Charles's investigation had provided him with the knowledge he needed to understand the source of family conflicts. But that knowledge came with the burden of having to act on discoveries that would forever change his relationships with the two most important women in his life. The careful documentation he had assembled provided clear evidence of a pattern of deliberate exclusion and deception that could not be explained away as misunderstandings or administrative errors. The evidence demanded action, but the form that action should take remained unclear. Charles faced choices that would define not only his personal relationships, but also his effectiveness as king and the future stability of the monarchy he had inherited. The December morning dawned crisp and clear at Highgrove House, where King Charles had retreated to gather his thoughts before the confrontation he could no longer avoid. 3 weeks had passed since his investigation had revealed the extent of Camilla's deliberate campaign against Princess, and the weight of that knowledge had affected every aspect of his daily life. He had maintained his royal duties and public appearances with characteristic professionalism, but those closest to him had noticed a subdued quality to his interactions and a distraction that was unusual for someone so committed to his responsibilities. Charles had spent the intervening time carefully planning his approach to what would undoubtedly be one of the most challenging conversations of his marriage. He had consulted with his most trusted advisors, not about the specific details of the family conflict, but about the broader principles of leadership and accountability that should guide his response to serious breaches of trust within the royal family. The advice had been unanimous. Difficult conversations could not be delayed when institutional integrity was at stake. The king had also arranged a private meeting with Anne at Gackham Park, where he had finally learned the full extent of her suffering over the past months. The conversation had been emotionally devastating for both siblings, as it revealed not only the specific incidents of exclusion and humiliation she had endured, but also her desperate attempts to maintain family unity by absorbing Camilla's hostility without complaint or retaliation. Anne's account had included details that Charles's investigation had not uncovered, instances of subtle psychological manipulation and social isolation that went far beyond the documented exclusions from family gatherings. Camilla had systematically undermined Anne's relationships with other family members through carefully planned suggestions and strategic omissions of information, creating an atmosphere where Anne felt increasingly marginalized and unwelcome at family events she did attend. The most heartbreaking revelation had been Anne's admission that she had begun to question her own value to the royal family and her place within the institution she had served faithfully for decades. Camilla's campaign had been so subtle and persistent that Anne had started to wonder whether her presence at family gatherings was genuinely unwelcome to everyone, not just the queen consort. The psychological impact of this sustained attack on her sense of belonging had been profound and deeply troubling to Charles. Armed with this complete understanding of the situation, Charles had arranged for Camilla to join him at Highgrove for what she believed was a routine weekend retreat from their London responsibilities. The familiar surroundings of his beloved countryside estate would provide the privacy and emotional grounding he needed for a conversation that could fundamentally alter their marriage and her role within the royal family. Camilla arrived at Highgrove in excellent spirits, chatting animatedly about her recent charitable engagements and looking forward to a relaxing weekend in the gardens that Charles loved so much. Her mood was light and affectionate, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere that Charles carried within himself as he prepared to confront her about behavior she clearly did not consider problematic or worthy of concern. The conversation began after lunch on Saturday, as they walked through the organic gardens that Charles had cultivated with such care over the years. He had chosen this setting deliberately, surrounded by the natural beauty and careful cultivation that represented the best aspects of his character and values. The irony was not lost on him that he was about to discuss the deliberate destruction of family relationships in a place dedicated to growth and harmony. Charles began with careful questions about Camilla's perspective on family dynamics and her relationships with various royal family members. He was giving her an opportunity to acknowledge problems or explain her actions without forcing an immediate confrontation that might provoke defensive responses rather than honest reflection. However, Camilla's responses revealed no awareness of having done anything inappropriate or harmful in her interactions with Princess Anne. When asked specifically about Anne's recent absence from family gatherings, Camilla repeated the explanation she had been offering for months about scheduling conflicts and Anne's preference for focusing on her royal duties rather than social obligations. Her tone suggested that she considered Anne's absence beneficial for family harmony, implying that the Princess Royal's presence often created tension or discomfort at intimate gatherings. Charles listened to these responses with growing dismay, realizing that Camilla either genuinely did not understand the impact of her actions or was continuing to deceive him even when given direct opportunities for honesty. Either possibility was deeply troubling and forced him to abandon his hope that the situation might be resolved through gentle conversation and mutual understanding. The king's approach shifted from exploratory questioning to direct confrontation as he presented Camilla with specific evidence of her role in excluding Anne from family events. He described the documentation he had assembled, the inconsistencies in official records, and the testimonies from staff members who had witnessed or participated in the systematic exclusion of his sister from family social arrangements. Camilla's reaction to this evidence revealed the true extent of her deception and the calculating nature of her campaign against Anne. Rather than expressing remorse or surprise, she responded with defensive anger and attempted justification for her actions. She argued that Anne had always been hostile to their relationship, and that creating distance between and the rest of the family was necessary to protect the harmony of royal family gatherings. The Queen Consort's justifications revealed a twisted logic that portrayed herself as the victim of Anne's disapproval and her actions as necessary self-defense rather than unprovoked aggression. She claimed that Anne's presence at family events created uncomfortable tension that affected everyone's enjoyment, and that other family members had privately expressed relief when Anne was absent from social gatherings. Charles recognized these claims as manipulative distortions designed to shift blame and avoid accountability for deliberately harmful behavior. His sister's grace under pressure and commitment to family unity, even when being systematically excluded and humiliated, stood in stark contrast to Camilla's willingness to sacrifice family relationships for her own comfort and perceived status within the royal hierarchy. The conversation escalated as Charles challenged each of Camilla's justifications and demanded acknowledgement of the pain she had caused his sister. He described Anne's emotional state during their recent private conversation, her questioning of her own value to the family, and her desperate attempts to maintain dignity while being subjected to sustained psychological manipulation. Camilla's response to hearing about Anne's suffering was perhaps the most revealing moment of the entire confrontation. Rather than expressing remorse or concern, she seemed to interpret Anne's distress as confirmation that her campaign had been effective in establishing her dominance within family relationships. The lack of empathy in her reaction shocked Charles and forced him to confront the possibility that his wife's character contained elements he had never recognized or acknowledged. As the argument intensified, Camilla made the strategic error of revealing the full extent of her jealousy and resentment toward Princess, and she expressed frustration about Anne's unshakable position within the family hierarchy, her decades of respected royal service, and her close relationship with Charles that predated and would likely survive his marriage to Camilla. These admissions provided Charles with insight into motivations that went far deeper than simple personality conflicts or social preferences. The king realized that he was dealing with a fundamental character issue that threatened not only family relationships, but also Camilla's effectiveness in her role as queen consort. Her willingness to engage in sustained deception and manipulation to advance her personal agenda raised serious questions about her judgment and suitability for the responsibilities she had assumed upon their marriage. Charles's response to these revelations was swift and uncompromising. He made it clear that Camilla's behavior toward and was unacceptable and would not be tolerated under any circumstances. He demanded that she immediately apologize to and take concrete steps to repair the damage she had caused to family relationships. He also insisted that she undergo counseling to address the underlying jealousy and insecurity that had motivated her destructive behavior. The queen consort's reaction to Charles's demands revealed the full extent of the crisis their marriage now faced. Rather than accepting responsibility and agreeing to make amends, Camilla doubled down on her justifications and accused Charles of choosing his sister over his wife. She argued that requiring her to apologize to and would undermine her authority within the family and damage her effectiveness as queen consort. This response forced Charles to make choices he had hoped to avoid about the relative importance of his various relationships and responsibilities. As king, he could not tolerate behavior that undermined family unity and institutional integrity. As Anne's brother, he had an obligation to protect her from further psychological manipulation and abuse. As Camilla's husband, he had hoped to find a path forward that preserved their marriage while addressing her harmful behavior. However, Camilla's refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing or accept accountability made reconciliation impossible without Charles compromising his principles and abandoning his sister to continued mistreatment. The woman he loved was revealing aspects of her character that were incompatible with both his personal values and the requirements of royal service. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation saw Camilla leaving Highgrove in anger, returning to London while Charles remained in the countryside to process the devastating implications of what he had learned about his wife's character. The arguments had resolved nothing while revealing the full extent of the damage to family relationships and the challenges that lay ahead for the royal family. Charles spent the following days reaching out to and with detailed apologies for his failure to protect her from Camilla's campaign and assurances that such behavior would never be tolerated again. These conversations began the slow process of healing the wounds that had been inflicted on his sister and rebuilding the trust that had been damaged by months of systematic exclusion and manipulation. The king also faced the necessity of deciding how to address Camilla's role within the royal family going forward. Her refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing or make amends had created an impossible situation where her continued presence in family settings would perpetuate the conflict she had created. However, any public revelation of marital problems or formal separation would create institutional crises that could damage the monarchy's stability and reputation. As the year drew to a close, Charles found himself grappling with personal and institutional challenges that had no easy solutions. His investigation had revealed truths that could not be unknown, and his confrontation with Camilla had exposed character flaws that could not be easily forgiven or ignored. The careful balance between personal happiness and royal duty that had guided his life was now shattered, leaving him to rebuild relationships and institutions from the wreckage of misplaced trust. The story of Princess Anne's exclusion had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal jealousies and insecurities to undermine the unity and integrity that royal service demanded. Charles's discovery of the truth had come too late to prevent significant damage, but early enough to begin the difficult process of accountability and healing that would define his reign going forward. The royal family would eventually recover from this crisis, but the scars would remain as permanent reminders of how quickly trust could be destroyed and how difficult it was to rebuild relationships after fundamental betrayals. The incident had tested every principle that guided royal service and family loyalty, leaving all involved with hard-earned wisdom about the price of putting personal ambitions above collective well-being.